For most people, Election Day is the day when they can go and vote to make a difference in what they don't like in the US. For African Americans and other minorities, this isn't necessarily always the case. Disenfranchisement. It means to deprive of a franchise, of a legal right, or of some privilege or immunity, especially to deprive of the right to vote, according to Webster Dictionary. Disenfranchisement of African Americans and other minorities has had many causes historically, but I'll focus on literacy tests, voter ID laws, and felony disenfranchisement laws. The issue of disenfranchisement is an issue that not only affects African Americans and other minorities, but it's something that threatens the integrity of the democratic system of the United States. In this speech, I hope to highlight some causes for disenfranchisement of African Americans and other minorities, and also to propose some solutions for the problem. Firstly, literacy tests was one tactic used for disenfranchising African Americans and minority residents. According to Carol Anderson, author of One Person, No Vote, literacy tests were initially established in most states around the end of the Civil War era when Black Americans were gaining more representation in society and they were just getting more of a voice in society in general, and whites were becoming fearful of losing their power. One issue with literacy tests is that the level of education between whites and blacks differed drastically, in part due to the lack of financial resources for black students. Anderson has written that one county in Mississippi provided only $3.51 per black child, but nearly 10 times that amount to educate its white students, which is obviously a huge difference. And in Alabama, over half of the adult African American population had fewer than 5 years of formal education, and almost 12% had no formal schooling whatsoever, according to Anderson. Another issue with literacy tests is the inconsistency in the administration of the literacy tests. African Americans would get these really long, complex legal passages to read, and they also had to interpret and show that they understood what they had read, while whites simply had to read a short sentence to show that they could read. Also, the registrar administering the test was the one that ultimately decided whether or not the individual had passed, and once that decision was made, it couldn't be overturned. So if the registrar had unfairly failed a black voter, then there was nothing that they could do about it. So now I'll go on to discuss the failure to reinstate the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the voter ID laws that came as a result. So back in 2013, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was not reinstated. And according to Clayton, this act was one that applied a nationwide prohibition of denial or abridgment of the right to vote on account of race or color. And so once it wasn't reinstated, it meant that states could just pass any voting policies freely without fear of being checked by the government for their legality. And so almost immediately, states began passing discriminatory voting ID laws. According to Brandisky and other authors in the article written Everything That's Happened Since Supreme Court Ruled on Voting Rights Act. So on the exact day of the Supreme Court ruling, Texas passed two measures that called for the redistricting of voters, along with an ID law that required an approved photo ID, excuse me, instead of continuing to accept utility bills, mail, or other proof of voter registration and residency. And other states also passed similar policies which shortened the registration period, put restrictions on early voting or absentee voting. And Kansas and Arizona passed measures to require that voters had to show acceptable proof of citizenship in the US rather than just being able to confirm that you were a citizen through the voting registration. And finally, all over the United States, we see that felony disenfranchisement has kept a significant amount of minorities out of the voting booths, and in a disproportionate manner. And this is a really big problem because, as Ludovic Blaine has stated, blacks are 5 times more likely than whites to lose their voting rights due to a felony conviction in their past. And in states like Mississippi, only certain petty crimes were eligible for a felony conviction, and murder and rape weren't eligible for a felony conviction. So this law ended up affecting blacks more than whites. And Shapiro has written that the thought process behind the law was basically pretty simple, as, quote, legislators in these states thought that blacks were more likely to commit furtive offenses such as petty theft than robust crimes such as murder, end quote. Now that we have discussed some causes for disenfranchisement, I will attempt to propose some solutions. So, like many problems, my thought first goes to increasing education and knowledge about the policies and practices to address the problem. So I think as citizens of this country who have access to a vast body of knowledge as students, we should do our part to educate others on the resources available to them for voting. For example, in Missouri, in order to register, you can do so online simply by filling out a form. I voted for the first time this year as a citizen, and this is how I registered to vote. And I found out from some of my peers that they had no idea how to register to vote, and so they simply just weren't going to vote because they didn't know how. And that was just shocking to me. So I shared the link with them. Additionally, individuals in Missouri, if you need a photo ID, you can do so at any DMV in the area, but you have to provide your full name, social security number, proof of Missouri residence, and $11 for the fee. And on a more national level, Project Vote was an organization that was trying to make sure that everyone had the necessary information to be able to register to vote and cast a ballot that counts. But they had to end their operations in May of 2017 because of some funding issues. So another solution is that we support these organizations that try to bring knowledge to people about voting for free. And then another solution for decreasing disenfranchisement is to increase access to polling places, like physically. And I think a lot of people heard about this, but Uber and Lyft offered free rides on election day to increase voter turnout by removing lack of transportation as a barrier, according to DuBois, whatever. He writes that Lyft estimated 15 million registered voters didn't vote in the 2016 election due to a lack of transportation. And this is just a great example because even though maybe they were registered to vote, they still weren't able to get to the voting place. And assuming that this claim is correct, it means that 15 million more people were able to vote this election than in the 2016 election due to just being able to have transportation. I would also suggest, though, that city transportation also have free or discounted rides so that people that don't have access to Lyft or Uber accounts could also benefit from free transportation. Next, having discussed increasing education about policies regarding voting registration and ID laws and increasing access to polling places, I will now suggest making changes to felony disenfranchisement laws. There's this organization called the Brannon Center for Justice, and they state, I'm going to read it, more than 6 million American citizens are unable to vote because of a past criminal conviction. Because of a conviction in their past, they are still denied this fundamental democratic right. These laws, deeply rooted in our troubled racial history, have a disproportionate impact on minorities. 1 in every 13 voting-age African Americans have lost their vote to vote the right to vote, which is 4 times the rate for all other Americans, end quote. So I think that pretty much wraps up all of the issues and why it's important to address this. And in Missouri, for example, those who have served their terms are automatically re-granted, except those that have committed election-related crimes. Those people are permanently disenfranchised. And in Florida, they recently passed a constitutional amendment to restore voting rights to convicted felons who have served their sentences, except those with serious offenses like murder or sexual charges. And as expected, Mississippi doesn't have any of these laws in effect. And so I would suggest to Mississippi and any other states who haven't done so to adopt a policy to allow ex-felons who have already served their time and haven't committed extreme crimes like murder, rape, acts of terrorism, things related to election, to regain their rights to vote. And so I will end my speech with this. Until disenfranchisement of African Americans and other minorities through the use of racially discriminatory tactics exists, true democracy will not. And it is our duty as voting citizens to contribute to making a difference. Thank you.